Hey everyone, welcome back. We've been digging into some really cool stuff lately, looking at how we learn. And you sent us this whole bunch of research, and it's all about how our brains handle information when we're looking at words and pictures together.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff, right? Like, we're constantly bombarded with information these days. Text, images, graphics, you name it. And it all mixes together in our heads somehow.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, I really wanted to unpack that somehow. Like, how does this combo of text and visuals actually affect how we learn? And the sources you sent us, they kept pointing to this idea of relational reasoning as a key part of the puzzle.
You got it. That's really at the core of it. What your sources really highlight is this idea that it's not just about adding text and graphics together, it's about the relationship between them. You know what I mean?
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What exactly is relational reasoning? I mean, it sounds pretty important.
Well, think of it like this. It's your brain's ability to find those connections between things. And those things can be words, numbers, images, anything. Like seeing how things relate to each other, even if it's not super obvious at first. Some researchers, like Alexander and his colleagues, and Dumas and his team, they've done a lot of work on this. Alexander et al., 2012, Dumas et al., 2013.
So it's like those connect the dots puzzles, but for learning. But instead of dots, it's ideas and concepts and the lines of the relationships we build. And the more of those connections we make, the better we understand something, right?
Exactly. It's about going beyond just memorizing facts. It's about understanding the bigger picture, how things fit together, the why and how. And our goal today is to really explore how that whole process works. You know, how understanding these relationships can make you a more effective learner, a better thinker.
Totally. And the research you sent, it focuses on four main types of relational reasoning: analogies, anomalies, antinomies, and antitheses. Those are some pretty hefty words.
Yeah, they could be a bit of a mouthful. Alexander et al., 2012, Dumas et al., 2013. But honestly, the concepts themselves are super relevant to everyday learning. So let's break them down one by one, starting with analogies.
Okay, analogies, those are pretty common, right? I mean, we use them all the time to explain stuff, like saying an atom is like a tiny solar system.
Exactly. You nailed it. That's a classic example of an analogy. You're taking something familiar, like our solar system, and using it to help understand something less familiar, in this case, the structure of an atom. Lakoff, 1993. Murphy, 1996.
Yeah, those comparisons can be really helpful, especially in education, right? Like, think about all those times we've heard the brain compared to a computer, with memory as RAM and storage as a hard drive.
Oh, totally. And those comparisons can really make abstract ideas click. But, it's important to remember that analogies aren't perfect. I mean, the brain isn't literally a computer. They have similarities, sure, but focusing too much on those can make you miss important differences.
That's a good point. So it's about using those comparisons wisely, right? Recognizing both the helpful connections and the places where the analogy breaks down.
Absolutely. Like Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, he always stressed the importance of using analogies carefully, especially when explaining complex science. They're a great starting point, a way to spark understanding, but they're not the whole story.
That makes a lot of sense. And analogies are everywhere in science, right? The greenhouse effect is a good one. It paints a pretty clear picture of how those gases trap heat in the atmosphere. Or thinking of DNA as the building blocks of life, that instantly gives you a sense of its fundamental role.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting. One of the sources mentioned this idea of combining analogies with something called refutation texts and graphics. And it seems that combo can be really powerful for learning.
Refutation texts. What are those exactly?
So basically, a refutation text is a way of directly addressing a misconception, like something people often get wrong about a topic. You present that common misconception, and then you immediately explain why it's incorrect.
Okay, so it's like you might think X, but actually Y.
Right, exactly like that. And you compare that with an analogy and a relevant graphic to create a really strong learning experience.
Yeah.
There was this study on climate change understanding, for example, where they used the car and the sun analogy to explain the greenhouse effect, along with the hockey stick graph showing the rise in CO2 levels, Danielson et al., 2016.
And the refutation text would be something like, some people think climate change is just natural, but the evidence shows it's mainly caused by human activity.
Precisely. They directly addressed that common misconception. And they found that this combo, the refutation, the relatable analogy, and the visual data, it helped people grasp the concepts better and remember them longer.
Oh, wow. So it's like tackling those misunderstandings head on can actually make the correct information stick better.
Yeah, it seems that way. What's really interesting is that in that particular study, the analogy actually had a more lasting impact on comprehension than the graphic itself.
Hmm. That's fascinating. We often think of visuals as the most impactful, but maybe a well-crafted analogy can sometimes create a more intuitive and lasting understanding.
It's definitely something to think about. And, we've been talking about analogies mostly in terms of text, but graphics can be metaphorical too.
Oh, right, like a visual metaphor.
Exactly. Think of those medical illustrations that explain how antibodies work. They often show a key fitting into a lock to represent how antibodies bind to specific antigens. That's a visual analogy.
Oh, that's a good one. I get it. Or like in math, when they show a graph of something increasing rapidly and they describe it as exponential growth, that word explosion evokes a powerful image, even though it's not a literal explosion.
Yes, perfect example. And some researchers are actually exploring this idea of intentionally designing graphics to be more metaphorical to better leverage analogical reasoning. What's the time? 2006. Saab et al., 2011. Stroud and Schwartz, 2010. Thomas and McRobbie, 2001. Mason et al., 2016.
So it's like using the power of visual metaphors to enhance learning. Okay, so we've covered analogies. What about the next one? Anomalies. That word makes me think of something that's out of place, not quite right.
Yeah, you're on the right track. Anomalies are those bits of information that don't fit the pattern, the things that surprise us, that challenge our expectations. Chien and Brewer, 1993.
Hmm. But wouldn't that just create confusion? Like if something doesn't fit, wouldn't that make it harder to understand?
It might seem that way, but actually anomalies can be really powerful for learning. When we encounter something unexpected, it forces us to pay attention. It creates this mental itch that we need to scratch. It makes us dig deeper, question our assumptions, and maybe even revise our understanding. Dole and Sinatra, 1998.
So it's like a plot twist in a book. It throws you off, but it also makes you want to keep reading to find out what's really going on.
Exactly. It's like that aha moment when you realize something isn't what you thought it was. And there's this research team led by Rani that's been doing some really cool work on what they call numerically driven inferencing.
Numerically driven inferencing. What's that all about?
Well, they've found that when people come across statistics that challenge their preconceived notions, it can really shake things up. Like if you think something is true and then you see hard numbers that contradict that belief, it can force you to reconsider. Garcia de Osuna et al., 2004, Rani and Clark, 2016.
Okay, so it's about how data, specifically surprising data, can change our minds. And this whole idea of anomalies, it ties into how we process text and graphics too, right?
Absolutely. One of the most famous examples is John Snow's map of the London cholera outbreak back in 1854. You've probably heard of it, right?
Yeah, I vaguely remember learning about it in history class. It was something about a contaminated water pump, right?
Exactly. But it wasn't just about knowing that the pump was contaminated. It was about how Snow showed it. He didn't just present a table of numbers. He created a visual map. And that map revealed a striking anomaly. Tufton and Weissmuller, 1997.
How so?
Well, he used little hash marks to represent deaths from cholera. And he marked the locations of water pumps with dots. And when you look at the map, it was obvious that the vast majority of deaths were clustered around a single pump, the Broad Street pump. It just jumped out at you.
Oh, wow. So the visual representation made the anomaly, that concentration of deaths, super clear.
Exactly. And there were even anomalies within that pattern. Like the workhouse near the pump had a bunch of cases, but the brewery right next door had almost none.
That's interesting. Why would that be?
Well, it turned out the brewery had its own water source. So they weren't drinking from the contaminated pump. And that anomaly further strengthened the case that the Broad Street pump was the source of the outbreak.
That's a powerful example of how a well-designed graphic can highlight the unexpected and lead to a real breakthrough in understanding.
It really is. And it reminds me of another famous example, the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster.
Oh, right. That was a terrible tragedy.
It was. And Edward Tufted, an expert on data visualization, he argued that a simple scatter plot could have potentially prevented that disaster.
Really? How so?
Well, there was this critical data point, an anomaly, that wasn't clearly presented in the technical reports leading up to the launch. It was the temperature on the morning of the launch, which was unusually low. And it turned out that the O-rings, which sealed the solid rocket boosters, had never been tested at such low temperatures.
So there was a potential problem, but it wasn't obvious.
Exactly. Tufte argued that if they had presented the data differently, if they had created a scatter plot that clearly showed the launch temperature compared to the historical data on O-ring failures, that anomaly would have been impossible to miss.
It's a bit frightening to think that a clearer visual representation of that one crucial data point might have saved lives.
It really highlights the importance of designing graphics in a way that makes anomalies stand out. And speaking of impactful visuals, there's also the famous hockey stick graph showing the rise in CO2 levels over time. Man, 2013.
Oh, right, the one that shows that dramatic upward spike in recent times.
Exactly. That sharp increase is an anomaly that challenges the idea that current climate change is just part of a natural cycle. Researchers have used that visual anomaly to try and promote a better understanding of the human impact on climate. Sinatra and Danielson, 2016.
It's like the visual equivalent of a wake-up call.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. And it's interesting to see how researchers are intentionally using anomalies to try and shift people's thinking. Like there's this website, howglobalwarmingworks.org, that Randy's involved with. And they use all sorts of surprising visuals and interactive simulations to help people grasp the science behind climate change.
So they're deliberately creating those aha moments, those moments of dissonance to make the information sink in.
Exactly. It's about using the power of the unexpected to drive learning and change.
Okay, so we've talked about analogies and anomalies. Now let's move on to the third one, antinomies. What are those all about?
Antinomies are a bit different. They're about understanding something by looking at what it's not. It often involves considering opposing viewpoints, paradoxes, or even conflicting ideas. Dumas et al., 2013.
So it's about understanding through contrast.
You got it. Like, think about the classic philosophical debate between free will and determinism. Those are two very different ways of looking at human action. And by grappling with the arguments for and against each, you can develop a deeper understanding of both.
Okay, so it's about seeing both sides of the coin, understanding what something isn't to better grasp what it is.
Precisely. And we see this in everyday life, too, like with optical illusions. You know those pictures where you can see two different things depending on how you look at it?
Oh, yeah, like the famous one with the vase and the two faces.
That's a perfect example. Your brain flips between two different interpretations, two seemingly contradictory ways of seeing the same image. You understand one interpretation by recognizing it's not the other at that moment.
It's like your brain is toggling between two different possibilities, trying to make sense of the ambiguity. What about in more like academic or scientific contexts? Are there antinomies in those fields?
Definitely. A classic example is Schrodinger's cat in quantum mechanics. Gribben, 2011. The idea is that the cat is both alive and dead until you actually observe it. It's a paradox that highlights the weirdness of the quantum world and forces us to think differently about reality.
Okay, that one's definitely a bit mind-bending.
It is, for sure. But there are examples in more down-to-earth fields, too. Like, have you ever heard of the Monty Hall problem? It's a classic brain teaser from the game show Let's Make a Deal.
Vaguely. It's the one with the doors in the car, right?
Yes. So there are three doors. One has a car behind it, the other two have goats. You pick a door. Then Monty, the host, opens one of the other doors to reveal a goat. Now, he gives you the option to stick with your original choice or switch to the remaining closed door. And the counterintuitive thing is that switching actually doubles your chances of winning the car. Illustrate with figure 6.
Really? Why is that? It seems like it should be a 50-50 chance at that point.
That's what most people think, but it's not. When you initially chose a door, you had a 13 chance of picking the car. That means there's a 23 chance the car is behind one of the other two doors. When Monty reveals a goat, he's essentially concentrating that initial 23 probability onto the remaining closed door. So by switching, you're actually switching to that higher probability.
Oh, wow. Okay, I think I'm starting to see the logic, even though it still feels a bit weird.
It's definitely one of those things that makes you scratch your head. But it illustrates how antinomies can highlight unexpected patterns in things like probability and statistics. And they can also be really useful in learning, especially when we're talking about graphics.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, they can be powerful for illustrating what not to do, showing how graphics can be misleading if they're not designed well. Like, there's this example of cover from the Ithaca Times that tried to show a relationship between college tuition costs and rankings in U.S. News and World Report.
What was wrong with it?
Well, it tried to combine two totally different scales on the same graph. Like, one axis was showing tuition costs as a percentage of family income, and the other axis was showing a numerical ranking, where lower is actually better. And then they used inconsistent time frames for the data. So the whole thing just created this nonsensical visual correlation.
So it was like a visual lie, basically. It showed a relationship that wasn't really there, or at least not in the way they presented it.
Exactly. It was an antinomy gone wrong, leading to a false understanding. And another example is the infographic that the House Oversight Committee put out about Planned Parenthood procedures.
What was misleading about that one?
It presented data on cancer screening and prevention services and abortions over several years. But the way they designed it, it visually implied this inverse relationship, like as one went down, the other went up. But the problem was the scales were totally different. A large decrease in screenings was visually equated to a much smaller increase in abortions.
So, again, a misleading representation that distorted the actual reality.
Precisely. And the researchers note that there's not much work out there on intentionally using graphics to create a positive graphical antinomy, maybe because it's a tough concept to explain visually. They even considered Venn diagrams, but those are more about overlapping sets and differences, not quite the direct opposition we've been talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so we've covered analogies, anomalies, and antinomies. Now on to the final one, antitheses. That sounds like a very direct kind of opposition.
It is. Antitheses are all about presenting two things that are in direct conflict with each other. Kreeser and Dallenbach, 1929, Dumas et al., 2013. And this idea is really important in how we argue, how we persuade, and how we change our minds when we encounter information that contradicts our beliefs. And one way this plays out is through what are called refutation texts.
Oh, right. We talked about those briefly with analogies. It's that idea of explicitly stating a misconception and then debunking it.
Exactly. And this concept has been studied a lot, particularly in educational settings. Like if you're teaching about climate change, a refutation text might say something like, some people believe recent warming is just part of natural cycles. However, the scientific evidence clearly shows that human activities are the primary cause. Danielson et al., 2016.
So it's about directly addressing those common misconceptions.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that studies have shown that these refutation texts are often more effective at promoting real conceptual change than just presenting the correct information straight up without acknowledging the misconception. Ariasi and Mason, 2011, Broughton et al., 2010, Gazzetti et al., 1992, Kende et al., 2014, Mason et al., 2008, Sinatra and Broughton, 2011.
That is interesting. Why would that be? Why is directly confronting the misconception so effective?
Well, the thinking is that by bringing up the misconception, you're actually activating the learner's prior knowledge. So they're already thinking about that incorrect idea. And then when you present the correct information, it creates this clash, this dissonance that makes them pay closer attention. And that leads to a deeper processing of the information and hopefully a change in their understanding.
So it's about creating that, wait a minute, that's not right moment in the learner's mind.
Exactly. It forces them to confront their existing beliefs. And this has led to the idea of refutation graphics.
Refutation graphics. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So it's basically taking this refutation approach and applying it to visuals. The idea is to design graphics that directly contrast a misconception with the accurate information. Mason et al., 2016.
So how would that work in practice?
Well, there was a study on teaching about the seasons. They paired refutation text with either standard accurate graphics or these refutation graphics, figures 9 and 10. The refutation graphics would first show the incorrect idea, like the Earth being closer to the sun in summer, and explicitly label it as wrong. And then they'd show the correct explanation with the Earth tilted on its axis.
So it was like visually debunking the myth right there on the graphic.
Exactly. And it's interesting because in this initial study, the refutation graphics alone didn't seem to make a huge difference compared to the standard accurate graphics. However, the combo of a refutation text with a standard accurate graphic did seem to boost learning.
So the text-based refutation was still the key, but the visual reinforced it.
It seems that way. And going back to that climate change study we mentioned earlier, they actually found that the most effective approach was a combo of everything. The refutation text, the analogy, and a standard graphic. Danielson et al., 2016.
Wow, so it's like the kitchen sink approach really worked.
It did, in that case at least. And it suggests that using multiple types of representations, ones that tap into these different forms of relational reasoning, can really enhance learning.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like giving the learner's brain multiple pathways to understanding.
Right, and it raises some really interesting questions for future research, like how exactly these different approaches work together. Are their effects simply additive, or do they interact in a more complex way? And how do individual differences in people's relational reasoning abilities play into all of this?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But even just having this awareness of these different relational strategies is pretty powerful, I think.
Definitely. It gives you a whole new lens for looking at how text and graphics work together to shape our understanding.
Totally. So, for you, the listener, what's the main takeaway from all of this?
The key message is that understanding these four types of relational reasoning, analogies, anomalies, antinomies, and antitheses, it gives you a framework for analyzing how text and graphics influence your learning. It's not just about the words and pictures themselves, it's about the relationships they create in your mind.
Right. It's about being an active participant in the learning process, noticing those connections, questioning your assumptions, and using those insights to deepen your understanding.
Exactly. And when you're creating content, whether it's a presentation, a report, an infographic, anything, thinking about these relational strategies can help you communicate more effectively.
It's about intentionally building those bridges, highlighting the unexpected, contrasting ideas, and challenging beliefs through the way you design your text and graphics.
Precisely. And for everyone consuming information, whether you're reading a news article, watching a video, or scrolling through social media, take a moment to consider the relationships being presented. Are they using analogies to connect new ideas to something familiar? Or are they highlighting anomalies to spark your curiosity? Are they using contrast to help define concepts? Are they challenging your existing beliefs?
Yeah. And by becoming more aware of these strategies, you can become a more critical and insightful consumer of information.
Exactly. Don't just passively absorb what you see and read. Actively engage with it. Look for those relational elements and use them to build your own understanding. And that's what makes us all better learners, right?
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.